We all learn things as children that need to be unlearned as adults. We have learning centers all over the world, but what we need are more unlearning centers throughout the world. In some ways, that's an important part of this church. It's an unlearning center where people can question some of the things that they've been taught and reevaluate some of the things that we think we know or take for granted. Because what we unlearn in a lifetime may be just as important as what we learn. Now here's how I got onto this train of thought. 2 weeks ago, I found myself on a plane heading to Romania, and I had to submit my sermon topic for the following Sunday. And I realized that our theme this month is unity and diversity here at the church. And I was acutely aware that I was heading to a country that has quite a bit of diversity, but very little unity. Now, I was heading on this trip to Romania to visit our partner church there with a small group from this congregation. And I think that as you hear a little bit more about that trip, you'll understand what I'm talking about. What's confusing about this is that the people in our partner church are actually all Hungarian and not Romanian. So Transylvania, which is the area of Romania that we were visiting, used to be a part of Hungary until after World War II it became a permanent part of Romania. So the Unitarians in Romania are actually all Hungarian. Hopefully you're still with me. So this is important because Unitarianism began in 1568, about 450 years ago, as a Protestant Christian religion among Hungarians, with influences from members of Christian communities in Poland and Italy. Unitarianism in America is so eclectic and so progressive that many people don't realize how old and deep the roots of this church are. As our group was walking down the street in Kolozsvár just a couple of weeks ago, which is the capital of Transylvania, we came across a sign that said, Unitarian High School, founded in 1563 by King John Sigismund. Now, it's the first high school in that part of the world, and it's been run for most of its 450 years by Unitarians. And yes, there was once a Unitarian king. Now, you might ask, how did we do when we Unitarians had total power and sovereignty over a nation and its people? And I'm glad to report that at a time when kings across Europe were killing people from other nations and their own nations over religious differences, particularly Catholics and Protestants, but Jews and Muslims were casualties in it all as well, our king, John Sigismund, used his power to usher in Europe's first declaration of religious freedom and toleration in what was called the Diet of Turda. This was a meeting and an edict called the Edict of Turda that came out of it. Now, we even visited the church in the city of Turda where this all happened. The point is that the Unitarian king proclaimed religious freedom and toleration and said that no person should be compelled in the ways of religion against his or her own conscience. That was 1568. And unfortunately, he died a few years later, and the next king, King Stephan, happened to be Catholic, and he began to undo the Edict of Toleration. So here we were, this group of Tulsans strolling through the capital of Transylvania, and we decided to walk into the Unitarian High School and see what it was like. Now, at first, nobody spoke English or had any idea what we were trying to say or do, so they took us to the vice principal's office. And upon seeing us, he looked stunned, and he immediately said, "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" It turns out that he has watched a few dozen of mine and Tamara's sermons on YouTube. How about that? In fact, he told us that already this year he's assigned 2 of my sermons from YouTube to be translated by the entire school into Hungarian as one of their assignments. He said, these kids have spent hours looking at you and transcribing. And so who knew? I'm a rock star in Transylvania. Or we are. Well, at least in this one little school in Transylvania. But he could not believe that we just walked into his office unannounced and unexpected. And he asked that, is there any way that we could come back the following morning? He said he would call an all-school assembly so that we could talk to the kids. He said they would be so thrilled to see you and so surprised. So we rearranged our schedule, of course, so that we could do it. And it was in the school chapel, which has surrounding it on its walls all the pictures of all of the Hungarian Unitarian bishops for 450 years. And yeah, we have bishops too over there in Transylvania. We told them that, as we got into this assembly, I told them that we have 3 services every Sunday in our church. We have a humanist service, we have a traditional service, and we have a contemporary service. And more fascinating, they were amazed by that. And what they were more fascinated in the fact of our inclusiveness here at All Souls, because their Unitarians are all Hungarian. There are no native Romanians or Gypsies, who are now referred to as Roma people. And these 3 distinct ethnic groups all live together in Romania, but they are far from united. In fact, and in general, they don't like or trust each other. So the Unitarian Church there, which I adore, does not have any effort to reach out to Romanian people or to the Roma people. They do not see it as a goal. They do not see it as an aspiration of their churches. Now, this was not my first trip to Romania. Back in 1993, I bicycled across Romania when I was on my mountain bike trip around the world. And so I explained to these high schoolers at the assembly that on my bicycle trip, I was treated well by the Hungarians in their villages, and by the Roma people, and by the Romanians as well, as I traveled across their country. And I learned to like and to appreciate all of them. The vice principal, whose name is Jolt, told me that that was a very important thing to say. He said, these students need to hear positive things about Romanians, to give you a sense of the kinds of tensions and differences there are. Now, I also went back to Romania in 2002 on a trip with the children and youth choirs of this church. And on that trip, we had one guide who was ethnically Hungarian and one guide who was ethnically Romanian. And they'd frequently get into arguments as they told us about the history of the places we visited. Now, at first we thought this was pretty funny and instructive to the kids to see how history is told differently depending on who's telling it. These guides had gone to schools run by their respective ethnic groups, and they'd been taught different and often conflicting stories about the same historical places and events. Before long, we actually had to ask them to stop yelling at each other. They'd get red in the face and veins bulging as we thought they were going to start literally fighting over the telling of this history. Now, I think that the only way that we can really relate to this here in the United States is to imagine someone telling the story of the Western expansion of the United States as if a person of European ancestry was telling a tour group from another nation, describing how the American frontier was empty and deserted until Europeans came along and civilized it and cultivated it. Right? And of course, you can imagine a Native American Indian translator or tour guide saying, wait a minute, it was not empty. What do you mean it was empty? Europeans drove us off that land. They sometimes spread diseases and killed our women and children. They even forced us through a trail of tears and violence and stole our land. No, we didn't. Yes, you did. No, we didn't. Yes, you did. You get the idea, right? Now, I also think of the Mexican-American War, which Mexicans call the first American invasion, when we stole the land or invaded, and there was a lot of death and killing of Mexicans in order to annex New Mexico and much of California and much of Texas, Right? This was by some in Congress were arguing this is an unconstitutional war, and here we were going in and stealing this land. And now today, you can imagine how Mexicans who've been living there all their lives, many generations before it was ever an American colony, when Americans were immigrating into that part of this country, but then it was Mexico, and then it was taken over, and now there are bills on the, in their parliament and in their Congress asking folks to have to show papers. If you look like a foreigner, you have to show papers that you actually belong on this land and are a citizen of this land. So you can just imagine, even here, we have these kinds of differences. I performed a memorial service when I first came to All Souls. I came here 12 years ago. This was about 10 or 11 years ago. And it was for a woman named Ruth Avery, a longtime member of this church. Some of you remember her. And when she was a small child, she was a small child when the 1921 race riot occurred here in Tulsa. And she remembers looking from her bedroom window as a little girl the morning of the race riot, and she says she saw a flatbed truck that was piled up with the dead bodies of African Americans just driving down her street. And she said what haunted her since she was a little girl was the head of a little boy about her age, and when the truck hit a bump, his listless head just plopped up and then fell back down. And it just was something that had haunted her. So she was telling this story years later to her own children. And you know what they said? They said, "Mom, you're crazy. There is no way something like that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We would have learned about it in school." So she went on a one-woman mission to collect as much evidence, photographs, and everything she could. And after she died, she gave it to the Historical Society of Tulsa. It's the third largest collection of documentation of the 1921 Tulsa race riot, just so that she could prove to her children. She said, "This is wrong if my children can't believe this happened." I'm curious, how many of you who grew up in Oklahoma learned about the Tulsa race riot in school? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 maybe, right? So, and that was about the same in the last service too. So not many. And actually, it's still optional whether we teach about it in school. So you can imagine these kinds of, what I'm trying to say is, this isn't just an issue of, I'm not just talking about Romania. This is a part of life. This is a part of human history. In fact, going back to the Mexican-American War, that was the war. Some of you who know Unitarian history, Henry David Thoreau, the great Unitarian, he protested that war. He wouldn't pay taxes to support that war, and he was put in jail for protesting the Mexican-American War, and actually wrote Civil Disobedience, which was a great essay that influenced Gandhi and later Martin Luther King. So these are real important moments in history, and it depends who you ask, whether these were right wars, wrong wars, good wars, or bad wars. So going back to my point, here I am in this high school in Transylvania, and I tell the students that when I was on my bicycle trip back in the 90s, whichever country I was in, they warned me about the people in the next country I was going to. So for example, when I was in Japan and I told them that I was going to be bicycling across China, they said, "No, you can't do that. It's really dangerous. There's bandits on horseback in China and they're going to rob you and leave you on the side of the road." And then when I got to China and I told them that I was cycling through Tibet, they said, "No, you can't go to Tibet. The people are dangerous there. They wear knives on their, on their belts." Little do they know here in Oklahoma, we wear guns on our belts now, but that's... But they said, "You can't go through Tibet on a bike. Really, it's dangerous." And this happened, all along. When I was in India, they told me about the dangerous Muslims in Pakistan. When I was in Pakistan, they told me about the dangerous sort of pagans of India. And everywhere I went, even I was telling these students that even in a Hungarian Unitarian village back then, I woke up one afternoon from a nap, and there were these women, local women, crying, talking to my host, and I asked the host, I said, "What's going on? What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, I just told them that you're going to be bicycling through Bulgaria and Turkey on your way to Jerusalem, and they think you're going to get killed." So these women were crying. So my point is that seems like we're afraid of our neighbors, and I explained that every country I went through, people treated me kindly, lovingly, and it was just, it didn't matter what country they were from or what country I was from, people were just wonderful. And when it got to the question and answer part of this presentation, one of the kids said, "Well, tell us, something that you learned on your trip." And I said, "I learned that people are people, and that we have to question what we are taught in church and what we are taught in school. We need to question and unlearn some of the things that we've been taught. And I was thinking about fundamentalist Christians who grow up believing that their religion, because they happen to be born into it, is the one and only right and true religion. And fundamentalist Muslims believe that their religion is the one and true and only right religion. And yet, if those same people were switched at birth into the other family and the other nation or the other culture, they would believe the exact opposite, and they don't get it. They just don't understand, and so they don't realize how parochial and provincial their views are. And as I was explaining it, people are just people, and the cultures are rich, and they bring spice and wonder to our world, and they're great, but underneath it all, we all have worries, we all have dreams, we all have fears, and we all have hopes. And no matter what color we are on the outside, our blood all runs red on the inside. And I explained that staying with the different families on this trip, I stayed with Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and people of all different religious stripes, and seeing how they loved their children and how they treated their neighbors and how they ran their businesses, I went away saying, there is no way that I could ever believe in a God that's going to burn and torture these people in hell because of what they believe. These were nice, wonderful people. And that's not God, I said. That's the devil. And I would never worship such a God. Now, I said that's a masochistic kind of a God. And I even went further, and I borrowed a line from my colleague Carlton Pearson, who said, that God is worse than Hitler. Hitler only killed 6 million Jews. That God's going to kill all the Jews. Not only all the Jews over all time, but all the Muslims and the Buddhists and the Hindus and the non-believers. He's going to burn them all. I said, I couldn't and will never pray to such a God. That's the devil. So I asked after this assembly was over, my host Jolt, how did he think it went? And he explained to me that there are actually 3 groups in the school. There's one group, about a third of the students, who don't believe in religion at all. They've given up on it. They think it's ridiculous. And he said, for them to hear that you have a church that offers community and religion to humanists, he said that absolutely blew their minds and opened their eyes to a totally different way to imagine what religion and church could be like. He said that about a third of the students are Calvinist, which in Transylvania means they're a fairly fundamentalist form of Presbyterianism. And those students, he said, for them to hear you say what you said about God and hell and belief in Jesus, he said that was huge. That was really important. And then he said the other third, the Unitarians, for them to hear you speak so positively about Romanians and the Roma people, he said, to learn how and why your congregation is reaching out to people of different backgrounds, he said that really was important. And I'm really glad I invited you because, well, I figured I was kind of an equal opportunity offender, really. I think I offended everybody at some point in that talk. But he said that it was really important because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get the kids to think, and that's what it's about. And it goes back to this idea that we have to unlearn as well as learn as we go through our lives. So this month, our theme is unity and diversity. And so what do we learn about difference? If we want to see diversity without unity, that's not hard, right? Look at Israel, look at Cyprus, look at South Africa, look at the Congo, look at the Sudan, look at Tibet, the Middle East, look at India, look at our own history. But diversity is a fact of life. It just is. But diversity with unity is a lot more complicated and a lot less sure. So keep in mind that every religion and culture has some teaching about how did we get here, all these different peoples in the world, and how do we get to be so different from one another. So in the Bible, of course, there's the story of the Tower of Babel. Right? And briefly, it says that people at one time in history all lived together. They were the same. We spoke the same language. We looked the same. We had the same way of being, and they were building a tower into heaven, and God said, this is wrong. People shouldn't focus their life and energy and all their resources trying to get to heaven. Life is much more important than trying to get to heaven. There's much more important things to do with our lives. So God figured the best thing to do is to create diversity and scrambled up the tongues and sent people off in all different directions so that we couldn't understand each other according to the Bible, and that's how diversity came to be. In other words, diversity, if you're looking at it from a biblical standpoint, is a sacred thing, is part of God's plan for creation. Now, also, if you look at this story from the Bible, it also says we are all one family. We are all one people. Beyond the diversity, we all come from the same source and are truly one. So the point is, every religion and every culture has its own myths that try to describe how the world got to be the way that it is. And every one of those that I've come across explains a fundamental unity of the human family and the role of diversity as part of the plan, the cosmic plan of how the world works and remains healthy and remains whole. So science, it turns out, over the past century has come to tell us the same thing. Right? Science tells us that we all came from the stars and that through a natural process of evolution, all kinds of biodiversity was created in our world. And in fact, we need that biodiversity to thrive and to survive. And the various religious descriptions and myths are culturally based ways of understanding. Science is an evidence-based, reason-based explanation of the diversity of our world. But what's common both to science and to religion is this idea that we all come from the same source, and diversity is something that is really important. And if you can even ask a stockbroker that diversity is something that you want to have. So what came to light for me in my trip to Transylvania is that this church has a calling. At a time in history not unlike the 16th century, when Unitarianism first began, we are living at a moment of great historic shift in human consciousness. Right? Last week, a group from our church and I took a pilgrimage to a town in Transylvania named Tulsa, the home of religious toleration and freedom. I like to think that someday pilgrims may travel to a town called Tulsa, to a 21st century church that took toleration and religious freedom to new heights. Maybe a few centuries from now, when people ask, so what did the Unitarians do when the world came to the point where we were all connected through technology and travel? When we came to understand the scientific origins of the planet and its people, what did we do? At that time, when more and more people in Western industrialized societies were stopping going to church, seeing religion as irrelevant, what did we do when we finally got to that shift in knowledge and shift in consciousness? What happened? And we know one thing that's happening, and that always seems to happen, and that is that there are those who do not want to accept the new realities of the new understanding. And so they get even more entrenched in the way things are in order to try to keep things the way they are. But when they say, well, what did the Unitarians do? Or at least, what did the members of All Souls in Tulsa do? I want them to say they did in their time what King John Sigismund did in his time. The 16th century was a time during the Protestant Reformation, right after the printing press was invented. Books became a new form of information technology, and ideas and new understandings were spreading all over the world. In that time, there was enormous change, and some forces doubled down and became even more entrenched and even more violent to try to keep things the way they were. But during that enormous shift in human consciousness, back in Europe, a tiny community of Hungarians with some Polish and a few Italians spread the idea of toleration. They accepted in their own way and in their own time that diversity was not something to be afraid of, but rather that they used their power and their influence to create a context in which diversity could thrive in safety. 450 years later, you and I find ourselves living in a similar time, when new forms of information technology and scientific discovery are creating a major shift in the consciousness and understanding of human beings. And we must be clear what our historic role is. We are still a small community of people, no longer just Hungarian, Polish, and Italian, but people of all different countries and nations and cultures from all over the world. And we must use our power and our influence to create a context in which diversity can thrive in safety. And that's exactly what we're doing in this church every day. And we're so happy to be welcoming new members into our congregation this morning. And more people around the world who are hearing about us through the internet and becoming a part of our church in many different ways, even if they don't live here in Tulsa. And what we're doing is not just learning, but unlearning some of the things that we've been taught. Many of us grew up being taught to be suspicious of people who are different from us. Even if we weren't taught this overtly, many of us kind of absorbed it from the people around us. I can think of when I grew up, this was before we had electric locks on the car door. So when we drive through certain ethnic neighborhoods, my parents would say, "Lock the door. Everybody lock the door. It's dangerous here." And we kind of absorb some of these prejudices as we grow up. And we need to unlearn those. Now, whether you grew up black and were taught not to trust white people, or you were brought up white and taught not to trust black people, or whatever ethnic group or way you grew up and were taught, I want to encourage you to really watch your assumptions come up, especially just for the next week. Pay attention to what are the assumptions that are popping into my head, and just be aware of what they are. Because I'm asking us all to do this, not because it's politically correct, not because it's some popular thing to do, not just because I have to put something in my sermon to give you something to do after the service, but I'm doing it because I truly believe that we have a very important historic role to play right now in this time of human history. And if you unlearn one thing from this message today, I hope it is that the great leaps forward in human civilization did not happen because some great man or woman decreed it. They happened because a small group of people dreamed of a new possibility, and they began living as if it was truly possible. The time of exclusive, xenophobic, anti-intellectual, superstitious, inward-looking religion is over. The time for inclusive, diverse, intellectually sound, scientifically relevant, spiritually nourishing, and outward-looking religion is upon us. In other words, it's our time. Our time has come. Amen. If there's one thing I learned in all this traveling that I did around the world, is that borders are kind of scary places. They're in-between sort of places. They're places at the boundaries of two different realities. And the truth is that this is a border church. We are, as they say in Spanish, en la frontera, on the border between the way the world has been and the way the world is becoming. And when we stand on the border, we need each other, because borders are scary. It's on the edge of society, and it can be a scary place. So let us hold each other's hands and hold each other up and prop each other as we go forward, because there's no going back. Go out into the world in peace, have courage, hold on to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings. Go and be blessed and be a blessing. Amen.